Mr. Clark's back. Time to take a look at how the Great Depression began to worsen in the United States during the 1930s and see how Americans really begin to struggle. We'll see the widespread unemployment in cities across the United States. We're going to look at the impact of the Great Depression on farmers. We'll look at the impact of human and geographical factors that created the Dust Bowl, kind of a crazy period of time in American history. And then we'll look at the impact that the Great Depression had on different groups of people within American society, including African Americans and Mexican Americans. So as we go through this, just make sure you're getting down everything you need to. Feel free to pause the lesson at any point in time to get down what you need to. And hopefully you'll enjoy this discussion here to kind of get a better perspective, maybe get a better appreciation for what you might have in your own life when you kind of learn about how hard hit citizens were during the 1930s. Okay, question one, how did the Great Depression impact or affect people in cities? Well, just think logically. I mean, you can kind of make some of these conclusions yourself. That factories began to close, people began to lose their jobs, they lost their homes, they were evicted from their apartments. So when you look at the way in which you lose your home or where you live, there are two different ways. If you have a mortgage on your house and you can't pay your mortgage is your monthly payment to live in a home. They foreclose in your home. If you're renting a place, whether it be an apartment or a house, then you go through an eviction process, and then eventually you're kicked out of your house or apartment, and you have to move on to somewhere else. And for many Americans, unfortunately, it was into the streets. Millions lost their lifetime savings. So even if you had done the right thing and had saved money for most of your life and had your money in the bank, and then the bank collapsed, then all of a sudden you lost your money. Poverty hit all areas of the nation. Those in cities in particular were the hardest hit. As you can see in some of the photographs here, as we move into question two, how might it have affected people's morale to wait in unemployment lines or bread lines to keep their families nourished and alive? We have a couple photographs there to give you a better appreciation of what was going on during this period of time in history. We have the citizens lined up there, very long line on the left side there for free donuts or coffee for the unemployed. On the right side there is kind of a hot meal that's being served out of the tent, and you can see the line wrapped around hundreds of people deep. So basically, if you were unemployed and really struggling during this period of time, you might have gotten online early in the morning for breakfast and coffee, and then jumped online for this lunch line, and then maybe later on for your dinner line. So you might spend 4 to 6 hours of the day waiting in line to get some sort of food. Very sad to say the least. So for the most part of the 1920s, people had lived prosperous lives. So it's kind of a shock to them. Fathers and husbands were doing really well, providing for their families. They had pride and confidence, all of which took a huge hit when the economy collapsed. You had to then stand in line with the masses and bread and unemployment lines. They did it because they had no other options. So basically, at this point in time, it was basically this or go hungry or go without food for many people. 3, how did the Depression impact workers who were able to keep their jobs? How is this similar to and different from the impact on workers who lost their job? Well, those who kept their jobs, so their hours and wages cut. So just because you kept your job didn't necessarily mean that you're living, a good lifestyle or living the same as you were during the 1920s. Both groups struggled, but those who kept their jobs at least could remain prideful in the fact that they still had a job. However, whether or not you had a job or you didn't have a job, you were living in a constant state of concern or worry. Those who did not have a job wondered if they would ever find another job, and those who had a job kind of figured when would they lose it? When would they be next to lose their job? And that was pretty typical of many Americans during this period of time. It's also, as an educator too, I feel quite fortunate for many different reasons to be an educator, but fortunately for teachers, and we even saw this in the COVID-19 outbreak, for the most part, teachers are always going to be able to keep their jobs in a tough situation because obviously education is going to continue forward. There's different points in time where there's budgetary cuts and some teachers may lose jobs, but schools just never shut down. You basically never have like an entire town school shut down and then everybody in that town loses their job. Unlike a factory that might be in a town, you say you have a factory in Metuchen, all of a sudden it closes down and the 1,200 people who work in that factory are all without a job. So from that perspective, some security is in, say, public education or like public service, like police officers and things like that, firefighters, all of whom we should appreciate. Those are the type of jobs that are always essential. Okay, during the Great Depression, Americans called their shanty towns Hoovervilles. The newspapers that they kind of wrapped themselves up with to stay warm, Hoover blankets, and then they would actually have their empty pockets. They would kind of wave that around as Hoover flags, indicating they had no money in their pocket. All these were signs of Americans' growing frustration with the Hoover administration. They had lost faith in the president because he had not really taken any positive steps to help them out. So when you look there at the photographs, you have two children on the left side there. Hoover's poor farm, tobacco fund, hard times are still hoovering over us was kind of the play on words there. Obviously, you can see the two young children kind of look unkept, unbathed. The center there is a Hooverville. You can see that's behind them is like the waterfront and some factories. So basically just took some open ground there and put together some wood-like shacks to kind of live in. These are the Hoovervilles. On the right side there, the final photograph is more of a close-up of a Hooverville. You can see there a young child in the doorway. You see a wood-burning stove kind of away from the structure there, because obviously if you put a wood-burning stove inside a small wood structure like that, you would think that would burn down and the people inside would either be killed or certainly the structure would be destroyed. So certainly can't put it in there. So from a warmth perspective, you might gather outside there, see some stools and things like that. But it's something that obviously, the conditions, beyond being in a shack like that, weren't that great with the heat, lack of heat in the winter, and really warm in the summer. Right, 5, what were some ways that desperate Americans attempted to make money during this period of time? Well, basically, they sold whatever they could. If you're going to have your house foreclosed on, you're going to get evicted from an apartment. You may not have any place to put furniture, household items, extra clothing. They pawned jewelry or sold their jewelry off, anything else of value that they can make any money for. If you can get out on your own, you might be able to downsize, maybe move from, let's say, a 4 or 5 bedroom home into 1 or 2 bedroom. Many farmers lost their farms. There's less support and help in rural areas than the big cities. When you think about even government assistance, more likely to go in and help the masses opposed to like a small 200 or 300 person, small town community. Seven, how did the low prices of wheat and cotton impact farmers? I'm not sure I did 6. When you look at 6, well, why were rural farmers struggling even more than urban citizens? When you think back to World War I, they had accumulating debt, a decline in farm prices. The farmers had struggled even early on after World War I. If you remember, during World War I, they had been subsidized by the government to produce more farm products for the war. And because the war had come to an end, they continued to produce at the same high rate, and there was nobody to buy that. The government wasn't buying it up. It didn't need for the war effort. And so they really struggled right after World War I, even before the Great Depression started. As you mentioned, less support there in the rural areas. Just some prices here, not to memorize, but just to understand. So in 1919, as World War I came to an end, the price per bushel of wheat was $2.16. 13 years later, 1932, 38 cents. So complete collapse. Similarly for cotton, that price was really soft by 1932 as well, 35 cents down to 6 cents per bushel. How many farmers lost their farms between 1930 and 1934? Nearly 1 million farmers lost their farms during this period of time. 2.5 million abandoned their homes and moved west during this period of time in hopes of a better life. Some people became tenant farmers. Big landowners and wealthy Americans bought up all these foreclosed farms. And then what they did is then they rented back to the same people who might have owned the land for generations previously. And then they would work that land and they would pay either a rent or they would give a portion of their crop yield to the large corporate farmer, the big wealthy person who bought up the farm land. And that's where we see, even within society, sometimes resentment towards the wealthy, because sometimes they may exploit bad times like this for their own gain. That's part of the free market capitalistic system that we're in, almost like survival of the fittest or social Darwinism. 10, what chain of events caused the dust storms in the Great Plains? When you look at the dust storms on the Great Plains, mid-1930s drought in that area devastated the region. The soil dried up. New farming methods made drought conditions worse, and by 1932, these conditions combined with high winds created a nightmare scenario that is remembered as the Dust Bowl. So when you look at how the Dust Bowl era devastated farmers, farms were destroyed as the dust kind of piled up. Not to mention the soil was so dry you couldn't really grow crops. People were temporarily blinded as the dust kind of swept through, and I have some photos to show you in a moment. Livestock died. Homes and buildings were covered in dust. The dust seemed to find its way through cracks. It got inside people's homes. All right, so as you look at question 12, how extensive were the dust bowls? If you look at the two photographs there, sometimes they say a picture's worth 1,000 words, maybe even more in this case here. The photograph on the left is a truck, and you can see the dust bowl or dust storm coming up behind the truck. The truck better really get moving, or else that dust is going to come over the top of the truck. You can see that the homes there and the farm there on the right side, basically going to be completely engulfed in dust and dirt. A lot of the Midwestern regions of the country, they have storm shelters for tornadoes, and a lot of people during the Dust Bowl had to go down into those same storm shelters and kind of protect themselves from the dust. And then they really had to push hard to get the doors open because the dust had piled up several inches thick on top of the doors that kind of put you down into the underground shelter. They reached over 8,000 feet in height, moved at over 100 miles per hour. So when you think about how fast that truck is moving on the left side there, it's going to get caught. The trucks here in the 1930s aren't moving that quickly, especially one like that. So just a matter of time mathematically before it'll be engulfed. It blotted out the sun. It seemed like it was nighttime and it was the middle of the day. And if you're living in New Jersey, you could actually find dust, let's say, on your car windshield or on your front doorstep, just because the dust was basically everywhere as it kind of moved in an eastward direction towards the East Coast. Next, we're going to look at a photograph here. We're going to analyze the photograph of the Missouri family picking up to head west in a period of time where much of rural America was struggling. You can see here what challenges might a family like this face as they traveled west in search of jobs. They are traveling with basically everything they own. It's even looks like mattresses and things like that, all stuffed in the back of their truck. Little or no money, no place to live, no guarantee of finding a job. Many desperate families just took a chance that things might be better in another town. They kind of looked at it, can it be any worse than it is currently now? And as a result, they made the conclusion, unlikely not. So they figured to take another shot maybe out on the West Coast. And that's how we see kind of a demographic shift as more people moved out to, let's say, places like California. When we look at the mass migration out of the Great Plains during this period of time, over 3.5 million people left the rural areas of the Great Plains in hopes of finding a better life in cities across the country. Many of these citizens would never return to rural America, as we saw a permanent shift into big cities. We even saw this when we were studying the 1920s. By the 1920s, the population had shifted into cities, more so in the rural communities, and never again would it go back to being more people living in rural America than in big cities. Okay, moving along. To hard times hit most Americans. How did the Great Depression get its name? Was this an appropriate title for this period of time in history? Well, this term comes out of the Hoover administration. President Hoover decided against labeling this period of time in history as a panic. They felt that this would be too scary to the American public and kind of basically facilitate panic and kind of cause more panic in the country. He chose the Depression. And you view this as a less severe of a term for the economic downtrend. It turned out to be an appropriate term, as it also kind of, it's a good way to remember the national mood during this period of time, as most Americans were filled with depression. Of course, during this period of time, the men in families were still considered to be the breadwinners in the traditional family unit, unlike today, where it's a much more shared responsibility. How did men react differently to the hardships of the Great Depression? Well, if you have the perspective that you're responsible for the well-being of your family, you're going to be really feeling kind of bad about yourself. Men labored tirelessly looking for a job. Some sank into shame and despair. Some even abandoned their families, and unfortunately, some did even commit suicide at a much larger rate than in, let's say, the 1920s, for example. The Great Depression also impacted minority groups more severely than, let's say, white families across the country. The poorest of the poor, many of whom were minorities, suffered the most. Many minorities did not have any savings or a support system to help. Some might be the first generation of a family in the country, and as a result, maybe they didn't have any extended family in the country to kind of help out. In 1932, African American unemployment rate reached 50%, 50%. That is a outstandingly high number for any demographic group ever in the history of our country. 18 analyzed the impact of deportation, the reportation of people of Mexican, European, and other heritage on the U.S. economy and society during the Great Depression. Well, during this period of time, hundreds of thousands of Mexican Americans and other immigrant groups were pushed out of the country. Also, too, we denied the entrance. We had a wide variety of immigration acts in effect, and also during this period of time, we denied German Jews from entering the United States, and you can just fast forward in history and kind of realize how catastrophic that's going to be and unfortunate and tragic for a lot of the Jews who may have made it safely here into the United States, who later ended up in concentration camps from the 1930s into the 40s. 19, cite some examples of who or what Americans blame for the misfortunes during the Great Depression. Well, of course, Hoover was the #1 target here. Overproduction of goods, quick example of that, just the idea that during the 1920s, as they were producing consumer goods, refrigerators, toasters, couches, automobiles, wide variety of different consumer goods, the vacuum cleaners for the homes. Electricity was spreading in the 1920s. People got their first electronic items for the first time. Well, all these type of items, you don't just keep buying, your second, third, fourth refrigerator. If you have one brand new one, you're not buying another one. Factories continue to produce these goods, and as a result, they just sat in warehouses, and the prices of them began to collapse, and businesses were struggling even before the stock market crash. Speculation in the stock market, people actually investing money that was not theirs, borrowing money in there and hoping to make a quick profit. The underlying weakness within the American banking system are all part of the 4 core areas that people blame for the Great Depression. Fortunately, during this period of time, we did see some Americans come together, some uniting amongst different groups within the country. Extended families moved in together to help each other out in tough times. We saw the soup kitchens and bread lines that were put together. People worked together in some of those Hoovervilles, and everybody collaborated to help each other out. If they had a little extra, they would share amongst the different people there. And a lot of donations. Those who did donate, which was a net positive during this period of time. Like any other period of time in American history, the Great Depression was one of a great struggle for the country. As we're going to see as we move forward in history, the Great Depression is going to last until the United States gets involved in World War II. So the real transition in American history, and we'll be looking at over the weeks to come, would be the United States involved in the war, and eventually, obviously, millions of soldiers going to the war, and the factories operating 24 hours a day again, and we'll eventually come out of this. But before we do, we're going to start looking at, as we move forward into the next section, we'll see some of the programs that Franklin Roosevelt, as he's sworn into the presidency in 1933, will put into effect to kind of help out the country. Hopefully you enjoyed our discussion of this period of time in American history as the Americans began to really struggle during the Great Depression. And until next time, Mr. Clark is out.